The question comes down to where do I start? And probably the best answer to that is right in the beginning. Let's talk about that first time when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Things may have changed since then. I've heard that they're mostly the same, but we're talking almost a quarter of a century ago, or more than a quarter of a century ago. I would hope things have changed somewhat, and I know we've seen that in other forms of mental health and neurodivergence. We have adults who've been making it through their entire lives mostly okay, but now they're in their 30s and 40s, and because of education and proliferation of information, they're seeking help that they need to deal with things like ADD or ADHD. I think it's the only type that's out there now, or autism, or being somewhere on the spectrum, OCD, and other types of, you might call them hurdles, you might call them mental health. There's a lot of ways you could classify it, but these are things that 20, 30, 40 years ago just weren't as easily accepted and recognized. And when it comes to bipolar disorder, that holds true. So as I said, I was diagnosed in 98, 99. Well, these days, maybe I'll go back and find the actual date. And what had happened was I was always high strung, always got my work done. I had 4 days off in a row due to just scheduling and a holiday. And before the fourth day, kind of had a mental breakdown. Um, I had kind of just snapped out of some sort of fugue state. I don't remember what led to it, but I found myself in a dangerous situation. I put myself in this dangerous situation, and I said, "Ooh, this is not right." And there was nobody around, and I took myself to the hospital because I realized at that point in time something was wrong. Many people don't. Many people would have continued with that dangerous situation, and the outcome tends to be tragic. Something in me said, go talk to somebody. So I ended up at the hospital, which then I ended up at an inpatient hospital. And it was interesting after that diagnosis. My aunt, who was a charge nurse at an ER for a local hospital for many years, heard about the diagnosis and said, oh, that makes sense. This all adds up. This tracks. We didn't have that phrasing back then, but if it were today, that would have been what she said. That tracks. My old psychology teacher from high school found out about it within the next year. He's like, I kind of had a feeling. So people who were familiar with bipolar disorder or manic depression recognized these traits in young me. But they never said anything. They never really did anything because I was going to work, I was going to school, I was performing, often outperforming, but there were lots of signs. Things like I would leave the house and be gone for 3 or 4 days. Some of that might be work, some would just be off doing things. I made good money and I would build it up, and then what we now know as a manic state would hit and I would spend it all. My emotions were often all over the place. I had a lot of severe reactions to relatively minor interactions. Something that might make you curse under your breath, I would fly off the handle at. Something that might be a little bit upsetting might put me into a downward spiral, and I would be in bed for a week. I think my aunt pointed out one of the things that really got to her was I was working at one point at a retail store during the Christmas season. This required a lot of hours. get there early, work late into the night, into the morning, and then uh, Christmas finally came around and we had the day off. We all got together at the family's house, and I fell asleep. And I fell asleep so hard nobody could wake me up. Uh, to the point where they called my aunt to come and try and rouse me, and she was able to, and I was completely disoriented. And of course, we wrote it off, well, you've been working so much. But then I proceeded to sleep for like the next 2 days. Important to note that during this time, when I was first diagnosed bipolar disorder, I also, at first, they looked at clinical depression, malnutrition, dehydration. Um, there was something else in there. I was severely underweight. There's a guy who during high school years was pretty fit, and 6'2", fluctuated probably more than I should have between like 175, 190. When I was hospitalized, I was around the 135, 140 mark. I hadn't been eating. I was cycling so much that in the manic states, I didn't take time to eat. And when I was depressed, I just wanted to sleep. So we had a lot of people that recognize all these signs after the fact. One thing that was beneficial for me is because of the way my brain works, and part of that's due to just me, and part of it's due to bipolar disorder, and part of it is due to PTSD and history, is that I tear things apart. I have to understand why they work. And I was able to do a fair amount of research once opportunity was provided. It's odd. They back then didn't give you a lot of access to the outside world when you were hospitalized in a mental health facility. Let's call it that. And it was a nice one. It was fine. It wasn't the horrible ones you hear about or see on TV. But once I got out of there, I was able to ask a lot of questions, make phone calls, look up on an early version of the internet, go to the library. And it was kind of interesting to see all these things that led up to, oh, maybe we could have noticed this sooner. Bipolar, though, is also one of those things that they don't diagnose, I believe, until you're, at the time, it was 18. I think they might do it at 17 now in more extreme cases. Um, I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you why they don't do that earlier. Fast forward just a little bit, we were still working on getting me leveled out. We were still trying to find the right meds. And in so doing, the medications they had me on, when I was on them, would make me very sleepy. 16, 18 hours a day, yeah, that was probably right. Um, and I also at the time had taken a job working for my father. It was hard to deal with all the medical appointments and some of the trouble I was getting into trying to level out because I had really spiraled. Um, and I was having problems getting up and getting to work on time. And I was tired before the shift was over. And my father was a harsh man, and we'll talk more about him later. Uh, he was great if you weren't related to him. Yeah, we'll put it that way. So he had called me to his office to talk about these missing hours and what was I going to do, and I was trying to explain, listen, we're trying to figure out what to do with these medications, this, that, the other thing. He said, well, I don't understand. I said, listen, it's bipolar disorder. It's, and I started trying to explain. He said, oh, that, it's all in your head. Yeah, yeah, it is. Very good. That definitely caused a rift between us at that point in time. I'm sitting here trying to figure things out, and I needed support, and I wasn't getting it. Um, and, someone that I definitely would have hoped and expected support from, there was none forthcoming. That kind of set the pace for the next several years. I went through bipolar disorder trying to solve it on my own without the support. I did have one good friend who was also diagnosed the same. He was a couple of years ahead of me, had been going through treatment longer, and I had a wife shortly thereafter who, against all common sense and better judgment, stuck with me through some very difficult times and was very supportive. And while she didn't understand the bipolar, she worked very hard to work with it and even work with medical professionals and me to try and get me on the right path. She should have left way early on. Now it's over 20 years later and she's still here and we're doing great. Um, and we'll talk more about those challenging times. So it was something that snapped, and I was fortunate enough to have presence enough of mind to go find the help that I needed, only to find that the people who'd been around me and witnessed things for years, if they were so inclined, might have gotten me help sooner, might have prevented some of the trouble that I was getting into, um, and some of the challenges I was facing. Today, it's 2024, almost 2025. We live in a different world. People are more educated, access more information. Hopefully, more people are getting the treatment they need sooner and avoiding this. But I also know that a lot still aren't. So, again, that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this channel. Let's educate ourselves, let's help ourselves, but let's help those around us as well. And until I see you again, remember to be well, be safe, and be awesome, both to yourself and one another.